the mindset that we have adopted commonly in humanity, which is a materialistic one, reinforced by science that the material world is the only world. And this also makes people believe, well, how can you survive if you don't have a body, if there is no vehicle? And these people don't believe in subtle bodies or eternal parts of human beings. They don't believe in this. And it's almost impossible to even get them to consider it sometimes. So it's a really difficult job, all this.
Welcome, everyone, to That Death Show. We are episode 6. My name is Ann Kelly, and I'm with my co-host, Tim Wyatt. How are you this week, Tim?
Well, I'm very well, apart from the fact that things have got very complicated and I like a simple life, and the two things are not compatible, but it's okay.
I certainly understand, and I feel your pain. We've got a lot going on, though. We're in episode 6, and over this last little month bit, I actually reached out to our socials and across YouTube, and I asked them directly, what do they think happens when we die? So I wanted to read just a few of the responses. Nova has written in and said, who knows? We can guess and rant, but it's reality that goes beyond anything we can know. Rather, isn't it better to bring our attention to living and not dying? Well said, Nova. Yeshua Maitreya beautifully says, you wake up. I thought that was brilliant. Also, Voxelant said, you will be born again. Now, these comments are wise ones coming in from our That Death channel, YouTube channel. But across the other socials, we had some other folks coming in. Alethea has said, we go through a review process. There's a second death as we leave behind our lower mental and emotional bodies, and then we enter Devachan. This is a place of rest and also evolution in its own way. And then we start the process of re-embodying again. And you can tell she is a fellow student indeed. And our beloved Jonathan Tim, Jonathan, who is a ridiculously talented artist. I think you've got one of his paintings at your house.
I have one.
He's a big fan of yours.
I have one hanging on my wall just a few feet away from where I am.
I love that. Do you know that Jonathan on our first episode gave us a super thanks, and that means he donated some money. He gave us $10, and we want to say thank you, Jonathan, for that. That means I know it means a lot. He writes, our souls transmigrate to a higher vibrational density, and our bodies turn into poop. To quote the late great theosophical philosopher Tupac Shakur, he quotes, my only fear of death is reincarnation. So that's well said. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. We want to remind everyone about Tim's most recent documentary, again, The Myth of Death, completely collaborating at global film festivals. Remember, you watch it for free right here on our YouTube channel at That Death Show. And coming in the new year, we have booked some visionary souls, some thought leaders like Dr. B has agreed to be on with us, Dr. Eddie Villamoria, and Antti Savinainen. I'm saying that right. Is it Savinainen? More experts in the field will be joining us. These are some brilliant souls. They are on the way. And here on this podcast at That Death Show, our goal, Tim and I, we wish to help eliminate the fear and the mystery surrounding death, to offer comfort and hope, because through understanding death, you can learn the meaning of life. And you don't have to have a near-death experience in order to bring back that wisdom that is gained there. Now, today, our subject is, we're going to be diving in to death rites and funerary practices throughout history. Now, to me, Tim, it's clear that the funeral is not so much for the departed, but it is for those still in the physical world. Before we launch into that, I wanted to ask you, Tim, what are your personal plans for death? What are you going to have done?
Well, a few years ago, actually conducted a few dozen funerals as a funeral celebrant of no particular religion or another. And this taught me quite a lot. And that is that people essentially these days don't seem to like funerals very much indeed, which is why you get all these adverts on the television at the moment about just doing a very simple job, straight to the crematorium, ashes back to the friends or relatives or family. That's it. And that's what I'm going to go for. Just something simple. I don't want any elaborate ceremonies. These were things which were very important to people in the past, but they've assumed a much less significance now, perhaps because of the huge costs which are sometimes involved in these things.
What is ridiculous, the amount of money we spend on that moment of transition, these thousands and thousands of pounds on flowers and caskets and all that, and the fanfare. It truly is for those who remain, not so much for, oh, at my funeral, I want this. Because are you there at your funeral? Do you think that we attend our own funerals in the spirit world?
Well, you're absolutely right about the fact that they are for the family and for the loved ones and the people who are left behind. And this is a time-honored way of remembering someone's life, just the way that a baptism of some kind or a birth ceremony is equally important. These are the two rituals at either end of our lives. And a funeral has traditionally been seen as a way of sending people on a journey of some kind. And our ancestors, that's how they regarded death often, as a journey. For example, the Vikings famously sent out their dead in flaming longboats into the night and everything, creating a real spectacle, because they believed that the soul of that departed person was embarking on a journey.
Yes, the Vikings and their big, glorious send-off. That was one of the first things that came to mind when this topic was suggested, that and the sky burial of the Tibetans. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about the psychological importance, though, of having such a big fanfare at send-off of this transition. What is the psychological impact, if you will?
Well, it's just a fundamental human reaction to know that you're not going to see somebody again, whether that person is a friend or your mother or your father or your sister or a relative. It doesn't matter. You know you will never see that person again. And typically, people, even who don't like other people to a great extent, still indulge in a degree of grief after they've gone. So the funeral is seen as almost like a final act to send that person away. It's the last contact that you have with that person who played an important part in your life. That's why it's typically always been important. And obviously there were spiritual underpinnings to this in different groups of people at different times in human history.
And the fire on the water, was that significant for the Vikings? Did they, to send out to sea, was that in a way of going up to the Empyrean, or what was the reason for fire upon water? Do you know?
Well, I don't know the specific reasons for that, other than the fact that it was very spectacular. And the Vikings were a warrior race, and their view of the afterlife was a place called Valhalla, which was like a hall of the gods. And it had 800 doors apparently to it. And there the Vikings went and just carried on doing the things that they'd done in earthly life, mainly fighting, feasting, and doing something else that begins with an F that we couldn't possibly mention here.
Well, we could, but we won't.
We won't.
Try to keep it family friendly.
Anyway.
But so is it similar to what the Egyptians thought, that they believed in an afterlife, but not a physical reincarnation on Earth? Is it very similar to that?
Yes, I think it is. Certainly the Egyptians took death very, very seriously, and their whole life, the whole culture was centered on death, although they didn't believe in reincarnation as such. They believed that the soul of the departed, there were two parts to it. One was called Ka and the other was called Ba. And if the right funerary practices were undertaken, and these were elaborate, and if the right prayers were incanted, then the soul of the departed could spend the rest of eternity traversing the skies with the sun god Ra. That was the idea. But certainly no other civilization that I'm aware of has ever gone to such enormous lengths to prepare people for death, embalming, creating elaborate sarcophagi, and even mummifying their pets. They found millions and millions of mummified cats in Egypt, for example. So they took this really seriously. And obviously, the Egyptian civilization was around for many thousands of years. And so there are many, many examples of this, which continue to fascinate people.
Well, that's true. I did see something when I was scrolling the other night about the Screaming Man, I think it was called, a mummy that was buried without the proper rites back in ancient Egypt. His fear at death was that he would not be able to go off into the afterlife. So in a way, I would believe that would be sending him to hell, I think. So it was really their own perception of an afterlife, but not reincarnation. What about the tombs? I know that there's so many things covering now. It's obvious the pyramids are not tombs, are they?
No, absolutely not. No more than a petrol station in the UK is the site of tombs or anything, although there may be dead people buried deep in the foundations there. No, the tombs were very specific. They have the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, and I've been lucky enough to visit these places where there are hundreds of tombs. They've never ever found a body in a pyramid. They've found empty stone sarcophagi. But it's my view that these were used for ceremonial purposes as part of the mystery schools rather than a way of getting rid of the dead. Although some people have described the pyramids as excarnation machines, where somehow the soul of a dead person is transmitted into the afterlife, into another world. But I don't think there's a great deal of evidence for that, given the huge evidence for burials in other parts of Egypt.
What about the hierarchy on Earth? Would it have been money and status of earthly achievements that would equate to what they prepped for the afterlife? Or did not everybody got the same treatment, did they, in ancient Egypt?
Not at all. It was very, very unequal. And the afterlife closely mirrored life on Earth in terms of its wealth and hierarchy. Sometimes very rich and aristocratic Egyptians would have their servants entombed with them, and they would create an environment with tables and chairs and look at some of the fantastic objects that were found in these tombs, particularly Tutankhamun's. And so they mirrored the afterlife. So somebody who had lots of servants and lots of wealth in their physical life would have the same opportunities and the same luxuries in the afterlife, right down to food and drink as well.
Well, I was thinking the servants probably weren't ready to die. They might have sent them on their way so they could accompany their master, didn't they? And wives, too.
Well, indeed. I mean, I'm not suggesting that people were deliberately killed. But what we have to remember here, and we have to put it in a kind of context, because even at the height of Egyptian civilization, when people were generally well-fed, conditions were good, and there weren't any particular invasions, the average age of Egyptians was only around about 35, 40 at the most. And therefore, that's half the amount of time that most people, certainly in the West, now live to. So they spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about death, even though they didn't believe in reincarnation.
Thank you. You shared that in our first broadcast, and I always learn so much on these broadcasts with you, on these podcasts. Now, we touched on this a little bit about the Buddhists and the Eastern religions, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which you have studied very well, by the way. If you want your own Book of the Dead, definitely check out the links we've included in these podcasts for everyone's Book of the Dead, which Tim has written, and I have included links at his firewheelbooks.co.uk. But the Buddhists, apparently, from what you've said, they have calculated the number of days that the soul transitions, the number of earthly days. So it's close to Earth after death. Can you explain some on the Buddhist and the Tibetan Book of the Dead for us, please?
Well, there are different Buddhist traditions, and they don't all believe in exactly the same thing. But a popular belief is that only 49 days elapse between the death of a person and the reincarnation of that particular soul. Now, this is not a commonly held view elsewhere. Indeed, other traditions put the period between lives at hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. But certainly the Buddhists talk about a number of similarities. A lot of them talk about fierce creatures and malign entities that they have to encounter and be judged by. But this is also common to other religions where there's an element of judgment involved in this. It was true in the Egyptian religion where the souls of the dead were weighed by a feather by the goddess Mat, and those that either were too heavy or too light didn't pass through. But the Tibetans, certainly in the time that they have been Buddhist since about the 8th or 9th century, they have this thing, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Barda Todol, which describes in great detail this afterlife journey. In fact, Bar means in between. and do means island. So it's like a route map for the afterlife, and it offers people guidance and knowledge of the various states which they will go through. And they talk about this blissful state of clear light. And of course, this is common to many different religions. But the Buddhists, of course, traditionally, from the very beginnings, have believed and enshrined in a view of reincarnation. Although crucially, Buddhists don't believe in a godlike figure.
That is strange. They don't have that at the end. They say theosophy is very similar to Buddhism, but there's the absolute that goes beyond. It is, I think, the most synonymous when I try to explain what theosophy is to someone. But they don't have a God, but they do have Buddha, who is enlightened, but he is not the God, correct?
Yes, and also he's only one of a series of incarnations of that particular Buddha over vast periods of time, a presiding entity. And this is true of many other avatars. I mean, the Hindus talk about a number of avatars who come to Earth to teach mankind vital information, wisdom, knowledge, etc., etc. And the Hindus, I think, have had 9 of these avatars, and the 10th one, the Kalki avatar, is due anytime soon. And this ties in with the second coming of Jesus or the arrival of some other wise figure on earth, as we've had frequently in the past, Krishna, Orpheus, Hermes, and all these other characters.
Are we not all on the path to become gods ourselves? Or we are not gods in miniature?
Well, some traditions, such as the theosophical tradition and similar things, they say this very specifically. We are all sparks of the divine, and we're all gods in the making. And the earth, from that point of view, can be regarded as a factory for making gods eventually.
Well, it is a very difficult place to be. In some ways, it's also a miraculous place to be. Earth is the ultimate place of learning through trials and joys and pain. We are shaping ourselves. We are here to learn. But that spark of the divine that is inside all of us, it isn't immediate. I think some people who hear that and think, oh, we're all supposed to become gods. This is over an incalculable period of time, of manvantaras and things that are really, really really big. And so, but we all are on the path, and especially those who are working to overcome your lower self and your ignorance and your fear and your judgment and your greed and your anger and all that. So there's more to that, and we can certainly touch on that. I wanted to talk about one of the things that came to mind as well when you suggested this episode was the sky burial, which I think is one, it is jarring when people find out about it, but two, it is such a beautiful recycle. I love that. And I know it could be visually horrifying, but it is beautiful. Can you explain about the sky burial, please?
Yes, in Tibet, where it's typically carried out, although in other parts of the Himalayas too, there's a long tradition of people after death being taken to a special group of people who are like, well, human butchers who decapitate the corpse and then take the parts of that corpse onto mountainsides where it's left. And obviously, being high in the sky, there are many birds of prey, and they come down and eventually peck that corpse clean until only the bones are left. And there are very dramatic pictures, almost of seas of ribs and skulls and everything. And typically, the Tibetans actually use I think, a leg bone to make a particular sort of flute. So that's another form of recycling as well.
I think in the Western world, we don't see dead bodies. We don't spend time thinking about death. Some of the responses on Facebook were, I don't even want to think about it. I'm afraid of it, about death. We just don't have dead bodies in our, maybe, I don't know, maybe because of the safe health and safety. We just don't. But I think it is beautiful. That's what we do. We return to the earth. I think that is the most important thing to remember. We return to the earth. To me, Tim, polishing, like, I don't know. I know you say that the Egyptians, they did embalm, but in the 17th and 18th century, we started polishing the bodies with these chemicals and preserving them and then putting them in these boxes to keep them looking as they did during life forever in a box in the ground. To me, that would be like shellacking a piece of poop before flushing it. I don't get it. What is happening? Was it the Victorians? Why did we start injecting our bodies with chemicals?
Well, it was a Victorian thing, and obviously Victorian funerals were very elaborate. And in the large cities towards the end of the middle of the 19th century, all the graveyards were full. In Paris, a few years earlier, a whole graveyard had collapsed with millions and millions of bodies in it. So what they did, they started building really elaborate cemeteries on the outskirts of cities, connected by railway lines and roads and everything, where people with money could build huge family mausoleums. So, you could be buried alongside Uncle Fred and your grandmother and everybody else as part of a family dynasty. But in a sense, you're absolutely right. It's almost as if people can't accept they're dead and they just have to be, as they were in life, buried somewhere beneath the ground. But of course, even this became unworkable after a while. And that's why we now cremate bodies. That's why 19 out of 20 funerals are cremations, because there simply isn't the room to put all these bodies underground. And there are hygiene questions about all this as well, because bodies leach all sorts of nasty things into the soil, which can contaminate it for a long time. So this idea of dressing Uncle Frank up in his Sunday best and then sticking him in a box lined with velvet and then putting him in the ground for eternity, it's all about the family. It's all about the people who are left behind. It's nothing to do with Uncle Frank.
It has to do with preserving them, their memory, letting go, the grief, and the like the photography they had at the end of the 19th century, where they would have a lot of because photography was rare, and they would prop the dead up to have their photo taken, and in a way that was they just wanted to hold on to something. It's closure, I think, but I think it's lack of wanting to let go. I just do not get that.
Yeah, I mean, this is all and part of the industrial age, because the Victorians were beginning to think they could control everything. Prior to that, people had been living in the countryside to a great extent before the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, they were much more connected to the natural world and to themselves. And so when someone died, for example, in Ireland, right up to modern times, when someone died, they were put in a coffin and propped in the corner of the room while people drank a few pints of Guinness and held a wake.
It's normal. It's natural to die just as much as it is birth. And you and I attended a death cafe not too long ago about death doulas. They actually have people that escort you out like a hospice helper. So I think we are kind of getting our head around accepting that death is a natural part of life. I think a majority of the people are still frightened. And I did see a ton of people respond that absolutely nothing happens after we die. Anne, why are you asking us this question? It's ridiculous. Nothing happens. And that was a surprising amount of people. Still, but that's just a little poll that we did. We also touched on this in the past on these episodes about the wailing and the crying and the screaming and the yelling around the time of death when someone is passing away. In Turkey, I think it is, you can hire mourners to wail and scream and yell, but there wouldn't be an emotional attachment there. But apparently it's a sign of being important. I don't know. Can you talk about that, the transition period for the dying with those around them?
Well, I think part of this is a cultural thing. Often when you see people from the Middle East, especially, they do outwardly display emotion after a family member or someone close to them has died and everything. And this is a cultural thing. But I think certainly in the West, where people die in hospices and hospitals, the danger here is if people close to them, their husbands or wives or children or whoever, are in a state of great emotional distress at the point where they pass on, that can be a problem. It can be an impediment because people feel a sense of reluctance to depart. They don't feel that the journey that awaits them is a clear road ahead. They still feel this drag effect by the emotional attachment that they retain with these people. And this is why it's a problem. And it's said in every tradition, people should die in a quiet place with as little intervention as possible. Because this Passover time, the time between life and death, can sometimes be quite protracted. It can last weeks or days or certainly many hours. I've certainly sat with someone during the last 5 or 6 hours of life, and it's a very, very gradual process. And actually, it's sometimes quite difficult to detect the precise moment of death. And it's also a question, I suppose, of how you define what that is. Is it when they stop breathing, or when the heart stops, or when the electrochemical activity in the brain ceases? I don't know, but there are different definitions. But it's very difficult to note exactly that time. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. It's only happened to me twice. And so, it's difficult to know.
I think it's the most sacred of times. It is a very beautiful space, very natural space on the way out from this earthly life. What a beautiful place. But I didn't always look at it like that. I too feared death. Like when people say, what's the worst thing that can happen? They're like, oh, I'm going to die. That's what we still think that. But I think that, yeah, we will die. We absolutely will die. So how can we help people who are watching and listening now? What can we do right now in our daily lives in 2024 to help make death easier, better, healthier for us and for others? What can we do? What would you think we need to change?
I think people need to start watching that death show, and that will hopefully take some of the sting out of death. But on a more practical level, people just need to start thinking about the alternatives. And people don't, because people have very firmly held and rigid beliefs, which are often very difficult to change. And you often find that people who come from quite a religious background, where they were taught about heaven and hell and all the Christian stuff, they often reject this completely and say, well, this is all complete nonsense. Therefore, nothing happens after death. And this is reinforced very much by the mindset that we have adopted commonly in humanity, which is a materialistic one, reinforced by science that the material world is the only world. And this also makes people believe, well, how can you survive if you don't have a body, if there is no vehicle? And these people don't believe in subtle bodies or eternal parts of human beings. They don't believe in this. And it's almost impossible to even get them to consider it sometimes. So it's a really difficult job, all this.
And the near death experiences that are being shown all over the place. I watched one the other night. I listened to one. She came back and she literally validated the mental body, the etheric body. She explained it in layman's terms, what she experienced. There is far more to us than what the five senses tell us. And what we do here on That Death Show is we try to, like Tim said, take the sting out of death, but it is to add comfort and to know that we are all here. Everybody who has ever lived has died or will die, and it's completely normal and it's okay, and you don't end there, you don't end here. It is a transition, a doorway to a brand new beginning. Tim, what is the strangest and weirdest ritual that humanity has for burying the dead?
Well, the Australian Aborigines often undertake ceremonies that go on for months and sometimes years, but possibly the strangest one I've come across is amongst the Torajan people. There are about 1.1 million people living on one of the islands, many islands of Indonesia. And they have this very, very strange practice that every 3, 4, or 5 years they dig up their dead ancestors who've been buried in nice clothes and everything. And they take them out of the graves, they change the clothes, they give them a wash and brush up, offer them a meal, even cigarettes. And then when they're all nicely spruced up again, it's back in the ground for another 5 years. But it's a way of keeping up with the ancestors, isn't it?
It sure is. It definitely is. And it is a way that I can only imagine what that must be like. It's for those who are still remaining. I can only imagine after 20 years what that must be like. But in a way, I think it's great because they're embracing it. And in a way, they look forward to seeing them again. It's a way of being with the physical body instead of I'm stretched on your grave. They're actually having tea and cigarettes and laughing and dancing. And so, in a way, I think it's very interesting. It's disturbing, but it's also very interesting. I wanted to ask about the ecological things that we need to take a look at in working in harmony with nature. How do we combine ethics and the ecological things that we're doing with the bodies to find a balance between working in harmony with nature and these traditional customs and our modern concerns? What can we do differently and what can we do better, you think, with death rites and traditions?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to think about is, ways of disposing bodies that are in harmony with nature. And of course, when the population of the world was much less, burying them in the ground was the natural thing to do. Although, of course, many cultures down the centuries have practiced cremation of one sort or another. And this was revived in the late 19th century, as I mentioned earlier on. And it's a much more efficient way, although some people are worried about the pollution that causes when you think of how many millions of people die each year. They are looking at other means now, which don't sound particularly appealing to me, where they dissolve bodies in chemicals. And there are other ways, I think, of freeze drying them and then kind of shattering the bodies and then just scattering that on the land or something like that. There may be other techniques which science has come up with, but I don't think it's so much what we do with the bodies. I think it's our attitude to all this. And of course, some religions, like Catholicism in particular, are very against cremation, as are people of the Orthodox Church, because they believe one day all the bodies of the dead are going to be gathered together again and reconstituted to have a new life. And of course, if they've been burnt, then this makes the job a little bit tricky, doesn't it?
We just need to change the way that we're looking at things. We need to evolve the way we look at life and death. And you are not your body. You wear a body, you have a body, but you are not your body. You don't end with your body. That's the whole point of these ageless teachings, this perennial philosophy, theosophy, the Gupta Vidya, whatever you want to call it. It teaches you that you are far, far more than that. And that's why death is not, it's not quite so solemn, sad, and serious. It's a natural thing that we can take a look at. And even we have a laugh here. We giggle and we laugh and we look at it in a way that we just take it head on. And we want to take the fear out of death. That's the whole point of these broadcasts. Is there anything you didn't get a chance to cover, Tim, that you'd like to?
Well, I think that one of the important things for people to remember is that all ancient spiritual traditions, and I'm talking particularly about things like the mystery schools of old. The mystery schools were in Greece and Egypt and India and in many other parts of Europe and North and South America. And their prime function, whether it was the lesser mysteries for the masses or the greater mysteries for the more evolved, it was all about teaching people two things. One, they had a soul, and two, they were going to die and how to negotiate that afterlife journey. I hope, I believe that these mystery schools can and will be revived soon, and that will be their function again.
Please, yes, man, know thyself. The unexamined life is not worth living. That's what Socrates says. Now, remember, the whole point of these teachings is to take a look at yourself, not just physically, but all the way inside and do the work, apply these teachings. You can take a look at Tim's recent documentary, The Myth of Death. It's only 45 minutes long. That is the most comforting film about death I have ever encountered. It's free to watch, and it is sweeping the film festivals. Take a look at That Death Show on YouTube. And also, if you'd like to get a copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead, all of this is in there and so much more. firewheelbooks.co.uk. The reason we're here doing these podcasts is because there is a need for them. A lot of people want to talk about death, but they stop at this particular incarnation's death, or it's just the near-death experiences and the paranormal stories, and there's not really a lot of explanation. This is the esoteric explaining of everything, and we are just students together, because through understanding death, you can learn the meaning of life. So it's That Death Show. And next week, we're going to be moving forward to the invisible helpers. This is beautiful. The role of angels and nature spirits and fairies and other entities that create and sustain and preserve life, and how they work in harmony, nurturing the fetus and the embryo through from conception all the way through to birth. So that's what we're going to be covering. If you have any questions, please drop them here. Remember, we are brand new. This is only our 6th episode. We are learning as we go. Please like, subscribe, comment, rate, review, and share. Let's get this comforting information out to everybody who needs it so all can have access to it. And please, please, please remember The Myth of Death, free to watch on our YouTube channel. Check it out there. Tim, I love you, and I will see you next week. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Mwah.
Yes, goodbye, everybody.
Death comes to us all, but death is not a tragedy. Everyone's Book of the Dead by Tim Wyatt reveals a whole new perspective on what lies beyond this earthly life. The Egyptians have a Book of the Dead. The Tibetans have a Book of the Dead. Shouldn't you have one too? This captivating, richly illustrated book explores the mystery of death by examining it from every angle, sharing the ageless esoteric teachings on karma, reincarnation, and after-death states, as well as examining death and dying in different cultures, religions, and spiritual traditions. Death is not fatal, final, or permanent, but simply a transitional doorway to a new beginning. Get your copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead today at firewheelbooks.co.uk.